Hi, my name is Steve Rahi. I am a Premier Field Engineer specializing in System Center Technologies. Today's discussion will be part 5 of our ongoing series talking about operating system deployment in Configuration Manager 2012. Today's session, we're going to start digging a little bit deeper than we have in the previous ones. We're going to start looking at the task sequence, some of the logic that goes behind making the task sequence actually more powerful than it might seem just from what the wizard creates, and really discuss some of the flexibility that logical constructs can bring to the task sequence, right? So understanding the previous sessions really lays the foundation for where we're going today. And we won't dig deeply on any of these things, but I really want to introduce you to several ideas that can help whenever building the task sequence, and really to give you some pretty good flexibility. So we'll talk about a few things. First, I want to talk about the task sequence flow, just as a reminder of how things work when the task sequence operates. We'll demonstrate that versus just telling you about it. We'll also show you that in the logs. We'll talk about the logical pieces that can be added to the task sequence to add directional control, basically. Variables kind of tucks under that as well. It's its own separate bullet, but variables can definitely factor into the task sequence logic. And at the end, I want to show you a task sequence that I've kind of tweaked to leverage all of the things we're going to talk about to do error handling in 2012, or in the imaging process. So we'll get started. So let's talk first about the task sequence flow, and spend most of the time in the lab here. Then I want to talk about the idea of continue on error as a part of flow control. But to bring this in, let me pull in the lab environment, and we can talk about something live. Oops, wrong machine. Let me pull in the site server for now. So here we go. This is my site server. And if I go look at my task sequences, you'll see that I have 3 that I'm going to use to demo today. I'll start with this one. So we'll edit this, and basically just want to review. So I mentioned this in session 3, but if you look at a task sequence, it's literally a list of tasks that you do. And so a question that I often ask, and asked in session 3, is if you had to tell me what steps run in order, what would they be? And often, most of the time, people will say, okay, well, it's this group first, then it's this step, and then after that step, it's this step. And then I'll ask them, okay, what's the next step? And they'll say, well, it's this step or this group. And that is actually visually correct. And as you watch the task sequence, that seems to be the flow, but it's actually not, right? So as the task sequence runs and finishes a group, we're going to hand control back to the parent group, and then we're going to go to the next group in line, process through all of this, hand it back to the parent group, go to the next group, and on we go, right? So let me show you that actually taking place. So I want to leverage a couple of demos here. So the demo 2, specifically, I've set up a situation where we're going to have an error, right? So in this case, I've set up the apply operating system step to partition or to deploy to partition 20. There is no partition 20, and I'm doing that on purpose because I want to see an error come into play whenever I run this task sequence. So what I'm going to do is just pull in my my Windows 8 lab or system for a minute and kick off the OSD2. All right, so let's pull up Software Center. And we have OSD Demo 2 right here. I'm going to go ahead and install that. And it'll take a second as we churn through and do the different things. I'll kind of let it run here, and then maybe pause it a couple of times where it's taking a minute or two. But I'll let you see the whole thing, especially the error whenever we get to the install operating system step. So we're getting close to pulling down the boot image, and then we're going to stage the boot image, and then shut down the machine and restart it. And then boot into Windows PE. Let me go ahead and tell it to restart now. So we'll let it do its thing and boot into Windows PE. Off we go. Good enough. Quick as that. All right, so we're starting up and should continue on, do some partitioning and formatting of the disk. Partitioning, and should start to format here shortly. Trying to shortcut this a little bit. And here we're formatting finally. And very quickly there we get an error, right? That's exactly what I wanted. So I'm going to pop up the command window in here and go see what we have in the logs, right? So all right, so here, now I could go ahead with this command prompt window open. I could go ahead and tell it to restart. It's not going to do anything. We'll keep this where it is as long as the command prompt window is open. In most cases, just a bit of trivia, whenever I have seen a restart through the WinPE tools, it'll go ahead and take it down. But for most things, it'll stay up. So I'm leaving this without clicking restart because that will actually dump some additional stuff to the logs that I don't really care about right now. But specifically here, so we see that we're installing, trying to, and say that we actually don't have partition 20, obviously, and so we're going to fail, right? Failed to run. But then notice this, scrolling on down, let the parent group install operating system decide whether to continue executing, right? So this really illustrates the purpose of this option. I'm going to go ahead and turn this off now. This option that we have on all of our task sequence steps called continue on error. So if I go to edit demo 2 and we go down to where we had the error, apply operating system, and go to options, you'll see continue on error is not enabled, right? By default, it's turned off because the idea is if there's an error as we're doing our imaging, that's something that is a bad thing and we might want to stop. Well, that's sometimes true. Certainly in the case of dropping an image, if the image doesn't come down at all, that's kind of a problem. But it could be that there are some scenarios where you might want to go ahead and continue if maybe an application doesn't install or a driver doesn't install or that kind of thing, right? So we give you the option. Because this option is not set, then we just fail, and then we pass control back up to the install operating system group, and it also says do not continue on error, and so we stop. There's nowhere else for us to go further up in the chain. This is the top level kind of folder right here. I mean, they're all peers to each other, so there's no other folder to hang control to, and we just stop there, right, as you see in the log. Well, we can have a different experience if we tweak things a bit. So I'm going to go edit this one where I've made some changes, and this time if we look at apply operating system, we'll see in fact I've set this to continue on error. So when we hit the problem, we won't stop. We will continue to hand control back up to our top level group here, and then we'll see at this top level group whether this is configured to continue on error, and note that it's not, right? So then the question is, what will happen since this is not configured to continue on error? Well, let me ask it this way. If this were configured to continue on error, what would happen next, right? So if this were configured to continue on error, control would come back to this group, and because it's set to continue on error, we would take the next step in line. That next step would be to come down here, which would fail because there is no operating system to set up, right? We don't want that. If we fail in here, we want control ultimately to roll, in this scenario anyway, to roll back up to the top. So since we are not set to continue on error here, we still hand control over to the top level group, which is imaging. And notice in this case, we are set to continue on error. So since we're set to continue on error here, we're going to move down to the error handling group and continue processing, right? So I've already run this one time, so I'm going to go ahead and delete this folder so that it works the right way. And we're going to run this scenario again, but I'm going to use this task sequence instead. And I'm going to come back and talk about this error handling because it pulls together a few things that we're going to talk about before we get there. So don't worry, I'll come back and talk about that. But let's go ahead and run this for now. So I'm going to have to go back to my lab and reset my Windows machine, my Windows 8 machine I just imaged to the previous snapshot. So let me go ahead and do that. Okay, so I've got the snapshot restored, and pull in the lab. You'll see it's exactly the way it was before I started the previous image. Let me go ahead and pull up Software Center. This time I'm going to run image 3 or deployment 3. Yeah, I expect that, so we'll do it again. And like before, I'll kind of short circuit the process so we don't have to sit there and wait for it. You've seen all this before, so let it do its thing. And then I'll come back, and once we get into Windows PE after the reboot, I'll continue the recording, and you can see what happens now with this new task sequence. So we're doing the reboot, about to do that right now. All right, restarting. So we'll come back once PE is up and running, the formatting is working. So we are back in PE, we're waiting for the partitioning, then we'll wait for the format to happen, should go quickly, and then we'll see with this new task sequence what's going to take place. And I'm going to go ahead and open the command prompt just so that's ready, and then we'll be in a position to kind of sift through the logs. Alright, should happen very quickly. Notice this time we're not going to get an error. We finished, right? And the reason I've opened this window in this case is I would have rebooted had I not done that. But let's go look at the logs now. Oops. There we go. So now I'm just going to go all the way to the bottom of this and search up. So this time, actually let me go to the bottom again. Okay, so I wanted to find this in the log. So here we see that the difference now. Let the parent group install operating system decide whether to continue execution. And we are, because install operating system now, so install operating system, if you'll recall, we did not set to continue on air. So because of that, we're not going to continue any kind of execution. We're going to hand off to the parent group. So if I pull up my machine here, you'll recall that here I have the install operating system group. It is not set to continue on air, but imaging is, right? So if I go back to the Windows 8 machine, or the system that's imaging, right? So I come down here and see, let the imaging, the group imaging is going to decide whether to continue. And here the group imaging ignored the failure and continued on to the next step following the group. Well, in this case, imaging, the next step in line is error handling. So we can go on through and see what happens there. So the group error handling has been successfully started. And notice this line. The condition, there is a condition on the group. I haven't told you about it yet, but I will soon. But just to point it out, is evaluated to true. So there is a conditional that needs to be met in order to come into the group. So the group error handling has been successfully started. We're going to go through, and you're going to see us evaluate some steps. Basically, we're going to create or connect to the network. We're going to create a folder. Let's see where we do that. Then we're going to copy up some files to that folder. Yeah, here we go. So here I'm making a directory, running the command line to make a directory. We finish that. We're going to create the log directory, or that's what we just did. We created the log directory, rolling on down. We're going to execute the create machine specific directory. So you see us do that here, right here. Okay. Now, notice this name has been resolved. I'll just give you a preview. This is a variable, but I pointed out here, so you'll remember it whenever I get to that section. And then we're going to create a machine. We end the creating the machine specific directory. Then we're going to copy up a couple of log files. So we do that here, 2 files copied, and then we exit, right? So it's a very different experience. Now, a point that has been made before, and it's a valid point, is if we allow this condition, then in fact the task sequence itself will not report back as an error necessarily. It'll show success because it did actually finish successfully. However, there was a problem that caused us to go into the logging section, the error handling section, right? That's a good point, right? But the error handling that you'll see in a little bit is just a basic error handling section. You could do a number of things in there. You could send yourself a mail. You could alert yourself some other way, whatever, that there's a problem, and then the logging will be there. So you haven't seen the log folder. I'll show it to you in a minute. It's no big deal. But hopefully you get a sense for how that works. Just the ability to control flow by choosing continue on error or not when an error happens, right? So that's one way. Well, there's other controls as well. So pulling the lab out for a minute and going on to the next one, we have the ability to use controls for logic. And again, these are the controls. Variables kind of fit into it as well. I'm going to show you each one of these. I kind of piled them all onto one step so I can illustrate them to you. The only one I don't have to illustrate because it didn't really make sense for the demo is this one, but it's really easy, right? So there's a number of ways you can actually logically control what's going on. And to give you an idea where this kind of stuff is really useful. So a very common imaging scenario that I still see is folks will build a task sequence for each type of machine that they're trying to build. Well, the real nirvana of imaging is if you can kind of build one task sequence that handles every build scenario that you have. So you could have different requirements, as an example, for HR machines or call center machines or whatever types of machines, right? If there's a way to detect what those kind of machines are, then just by reading the registry or whatever, maybe it's an existing machine that you're trying to reimage and not really a bare metal machine. Well, you could use some logic here to control which branch of or which group or which step a task sequence will go into based on these. If there's a WMI query to identify a system with a certain hard drive space, then you can do formatting and partitioning differently based on the size of hard drive detected that you can easily do. And there's several other examples, right? So let me just show you these so they make a little bit more sense. Let me pull the lab back in. So if I go into this task sequence and edit it, actually this one is the one, they all have the same, so it's okay. But I put the logic here. So you see this group that I've added to the default task sequence that was created called conditionals. And I've just gone ahead and piled all of these options on it to show it to you, right? So notice, though, the if statement. So we have if-then conditions. It's not really an if-then. It's basically an if-all or if-any or if-none, right? So this one says if any of these subsequent conditions are true, then go ahead and let processing continue in this group. But if all of them are false, then just go ahead and skip the group, right? You could do if all of them are true, that would be fine, right? So there is an evaluation, kind of a programmatic kind of term called anding and oring, right? You'll see that in the log in a minute. Really, at the base level, what anding means is that all of these things have to be true. So if I were to say all, then we would and all of these things together and have to say, okay, is this one true? Yes. This one has to be true. This one has to be true. This one has to be true. All of them have to be true in order to pass this. If for any, it's really an or situation. This one or 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 this one, right? If we're doing none, it's kind of back to an anding. All of these have to not be true. So that's what that is, right? So on individual steps, you can have that as well. So here you notice that I'm dealing with the task sequence variable. I haven't talked about those yet. We'll get to that in the next section. But I'm basically saying task sequence variable provision software equals true. Here I'm doing operating system. Now pay attention to this one because if you look at the UI, it's just a bunch of check marks, right? When we see it in the log, we're going to see it's actually a specific WMI call. Here we're looking for a file. Notepad to be greater than 1.0, which it should be, file folder date to be greater than year 2000, which it should be, looking at a registry key to make sure the value equals this, which it should, and then finally running a WMI query. This one's interesting because you can just put in the direct WMI query here, and the qualifier to determine if that comes back true is whether we get at least one instance of that item coming back, right? So let me show this to you in the log. For sake of time, I've gone ahead and positioned the task sequence where these conditions have already evaluated, basically the end of the imaging process, and want to show you what it looks like in the log. But it takes a while, obviously, to image the system. So I went ahead and saved off the checkpoint of the system when it was in that state. So let me go ahead and pull that system back in. All right, so we've got it back. So you'll notice that I'm at the very end of the task sequence. I've got a DOS box up here. If I were to close this, then it would go ahead and reboot. But I want to show you the log. So I'm going to go ahead and pull that up in Notepad, and we'll go to the bottom. Actually, I'm going to search up from the bottom and look for conditionals. If I can spell right. Search up. Find next. And that's after it was done. So let me go to where it starts. One more. So start executing an instruction. Instruction name conditionals. So the group conditionals has, that says completed. Let me go on up a little bit more. Let me scroll, see if I can find it now. A lot of logging going on. Let's see. Yeah, getting close. Okay, so we completed setup Windows and Config Manager, so let's roll on down a little bit. The group operating system completed. Okay, instruction name conditionals. So here we are, the very beginning of it. So we have to basically work our way through all of the conditionals that we've established. So if we look through, we're looking at some of these are our task sequence variables, actually. All right, we'll talk about those more in a minute. And then we're going to evaluate an AND expression. So we talked about what that means, another one. And the first one we're evaluating is this thing called provision software. This is the one where I set a variable. And in this case, the variable has to be set to true. We look, and in fact, we find that it is set to true, right? Well, then we go and we evaluate more. So this is the operating system one, right? But notice it's actually doing a WMI query. We just put checkboxes for the operating system, but that translates to to a WMI query. Here's the query again, and that evaluates to true. Right here, right? WMI is evaluated to true, so that finishes that one. Then we roll on through, and we're going to look for the file condition. This is where Notepad has to be greater than version 1, right here. And so we evaluate that, and we find that that is true, right here, right? Then we do the folder, has to be greater than a certain date, and we find that that evaluates to true. So you see how we're rolling through these. Next, we have a registry key, this key right here that we're looking up, making sure that the data is C:/, which it is. Scroll on down, and we find the registry condition evaluated to true, right? Last one, WMI condition. Here's the one that I put in just as a quick test, and that one evaluates to true, right? So you can the whole point of this is that you can very clearly see what's going on and help you get a sense of why things are going certain ways and whatever, right? Hopefully you can get a sense of being able to use some of these things to control. I'm going to go ahead and close this, and you'll see it reboot, right? Being able to control, or actually not reboot, just pop in there. Being able to control the flow based on different things that you detect, right? And that's very useful to be able to do that. So let me pull this back out. Now, there are a couple of other things there's one other big category of things that will allow you to control the experience during a task sequence, and that category would be variables, right? So these controls, looking at the registry, looking at WMI, looking at the file system, all these things are great in certain conditions. But there are certain conditions where maybe you won't have something in the registry or file system or wherever that you can query, yet you want to control the flow of the task sequence. So variables really come into play, and variables are incredibly powerful in task sequencing to help you get to the end result, right? I call them the ultimate task sequence control. So a specific scenario is exactly the one we talked about. So maybe you're building a task sequence which will need to handle building HR machines, building call center machines, building executive machines, whatever the case may be. And each one of those machines might have some items in common that are added, might have some uniquenesses that will need to be put on those systems. Variables can really allow you that flexibility, right? Now I'm going to talk about variables in the most basic terms right now. I'm going to show you a couple of things. We'll talk about variables more, probably in another section, and so on. But let me just introduce the topic now. There are two kinds of variables, by the way. There's built-in variables, there's custom variables. Let me show you both, right? So if I pull back in the lab and look at this, well, first of all, there's a whole list of the built-in variables on the web. So if you open your browser and search for OSD ConfigMgr variables, you'll find a couple of entries. So there's a couple of TechNet pages that you can come to. I just pulled open this one, and you'll see there's action variables, a whole list of all the categories. There's the built-in variables that you can look at. Notice that the ones that start with an underscore, those are definitely built-in variables. There's a whole list discussing what they do, how they can be used. Variables are used extensively in OSD, even if you don't configure them yourself, right? So there's also in the task sequence the ability to add and manipulate variables. So if I go into this one as an example, just to show you the options, I can go and add under General, Dynamic Variables. Where is it? There, Set Dynamic Variables. I can set rules and different things. I can go through and add variables, either existing variables, custom variables, that kind of thing. Again, won't get into it too detailed right now, but variables are built in. Or you can build completely custom variables that you define and that you use, right? There's a few places you can do that. So the task sequence media is one location, the wizard here. So for example, if I build bootable media and go through this, I'm not going to save it, but to get to that window, I'll do standalone media or site-based media. Give it a bogus name so I can get past this. Take that away. Next. Here, just pick one. And pick my management point. Good. Next one, I'll have an option here. I could go through and add variables into this list. So if you want, for example, to have variables that help control the flow of your task sequence that you bake into your media, bootable media, you can certainly do that, right? Most of the time, I haven't seen people do that, but at least it's an option, gives you some flexibility, right? If you change your variables, you would definitely need to update your boot media, but it's an option available to you. Another thing you can do is inside the task sequence, you have the ability to add a variable, right? So I can go up here under General, and I can add a task sequence variable right here. Right? Give it the name of the variable and what the value is. Now this is interesting, maybe to combine with the conditionals we talked about, right? So maybe you want to run a conditional against WMI to find out, okay, and the example we did talk about, let's build on that, right? Maybe you want to run a conditional against WMI to find out, how big your disks are. So if you have an 80 gig drive, maybe you're going to partition it differently. So you can set up a conditional on that partitioning step to look in WMI, and if it's an 80 gig drive, you're going to, let me back up. So maybe you're going to use a set task sequence variable step, but a conditional for that is going to look in WMI and find out if your drive is 80 gig. If it is, the task sequence variable will be set to maybe 80. Then there will be another one, set task sequence variable, that will look for a different size. Maybe it's a 500 gig drive, and if so, it will set the same variable to 500, right? And then there maybe will be another step down below that will take whatever the size is and then carve up the disk appropriately, maybe a script or something, right? So it gives you a lot of flexibility. Maybe there's a given step within the task sequence that you want to run on systems that are a certain model number or have a certain type of processor or whatever. You can build all that in. You can set variables that maybe you discover at the beginning and use later inside the task sequence, right? Gives you a lot of possibilities, okay? There's also ways to configure task sequence variables in the console, right? So if I go into, in fact, let me look at this one, right? So I showed you that in this task sequence there is a conditional that says specifically that this provisioning software variable needs to equal true. But if you look through this, there is nowhere in this task sequence that I've set a task sequence variable called provision software. Well, there is the ability to set a task sequence variable on collections, right? So if I go to my target collection down here and look at properties, you'll see that there's a place to define collection variables, and there's not one here, right? But I'll explain it anyway. So if you want to add variables to your collection, then all systems that are within that collection will receive those variables when they start through imaging. This is where you start to get a lot of flexibility. So you could have an external process that you want to inject variables about a machine or group of machines that will tell the task sequence exactly how to build those machines. That's what you can do with collection variables, right? But we're still trying to find where that provision software variable is defined. We haven't found it yet. It's certainly not on the collection. Well, in addition to defining on the collection, you can come up to your devices and specifically define on your devices. So this is the machine that I've targeted the deployment to. If I look on my variables list, in fact, that is where the variable is defined, which again offers some interesting flexibility. Not only can you define the variables on the collection, and all machines in that collection inherit those variables and can use them for imaging, you can also define variables on individual machines. So consider the scenario where maybe you're building executive machines and all of them need the same basic build, but there might be a couple of machines that are unique and need a few other things. So you can either build another collection and treat them separately or whatever, or you can use the same collection that all of them use, but on those specific machines that need a bit extra, you just add a couple of machine variables and they get the extra stuff, the others don't, right? That's just one scenario, lots of possibilities here, right? But this is where that variable came into my task sequence whenever I did it, right? Well, there's other things too. Again, not digging into this a ton right now, but you can certainly configure variables by script. So there's a web page that I built as a demo some time ago on my blog that kind of walks through how you can take detail from a web page that you're going to use to define how to build a machine and then use code to plug it into a specific machine. So let me go ahead and pull that up. Okay, so let me pull it in. So here's just a sample. Again, this is written in ASP, really VB, right? But I collect some information just as a demo, and I give you the code, show you how you would insert the information into, ultimately, in this case, I'm not using collections, I'm using machines, but you'll see these are all the variables that will be inserted based on that UI web page where you can change data. All of this is used specifically with a task sequence to build the machine. I go through and show you in the task sequence right here where some of that is used and where these variables take place, right? So that's one option. You can use PowerShell. You can use Orchestrator to do a lot of these things. There are other ways you could do it, right? So one thing that also is good to know, again, just briefly, about the task sequencing environment. So whenever I first started working with task sequencing, I was really interested to find out, what's going on with my machine whenever it's imaging, right? What are the variables that are defined? Well, let me go back to my lab for a minute and show you what I mean rather than just talk about it. Okay, so I've reset my machine to the state you saw it before, right? And so whenever I was first working with task sequencing, I knew that I'd defined some variables. I wanted to see, frankly, what the default system variables were that were being leveraged. So I just thought, hey, for any kind of variables, I would just go out to the command prompt and look at set. And these are all of the variables. Well, that's true, but they are not the variables that are leveraged in OSD. OSD has its own own environment, right? You do see an underscore right here, but all the task sequence variables are not really visible here. In order to tap into the variables that are defined in the task sequencing environment, you would need to programmatically instantiate the task sequencing environment and go through and look at the different variables that are out there, right? That's a bit more advanced than I want to talk about right now, but just to point that out. If you go looking for the variables here, you're not going to find them. They only exist within the OSD environment, right? And there are ways. There's a good blog article that Michael Niehaus has put together, very simple script that will allow you to tap into and enumerate all of the variables in the task sequencing environment, right? So in fact, let me pull up that blog article real quick and I'll show it to you. Yeah, okay, here it is. So I'm just going to pull this in. So it's a easy article, dumping task sequence variables, and this is VB script. But basically all it does is it instantiates the TS environment object, and it does a loop and goes through every single variable and writes it out, right? If you want to see, and that's very educational, to go through your environment and see what all variables are defined, how they're used, and so on, right? Okay. So we go ahead and pull this out of the way and move on here a bit. Pull that out of the way too. All right. So the last thing that I want to do is kind of jive all these things that we've talked about together, kind of. And oops, I did not change the slide. I meant to just put error handling there. That's an old slide, but nevertheless, we can talk about it. So the error handling section that you saw kind of merges together some of the things we talked about as far as flow and putting continue on error. I don't really use any conditionals, though I do use a task sequence variable to dictate whether I go into that section or not. So let me show you that section again and kind of talk through how it works, right? So back to the software library, task sequence, and I'll go into this example. So we saw the flow already, where whenever I error here, control gets passed up here. Since we don't continue on error, control gets passed up here. Since we do continue on error, control gets passed down here, right? Well, the first thing that we have to figure out is how to avoid processing the error handling section if there has not been an error, right? If imaging completes in this section without a problem, no error, then you probably don't care to process the error handling section, right? So that's where one of these default task sequence variables really comes into play. So this one is the underscore SMSTS last action succeeded variable. So we'll track the progress of our task sequence in different ways and know what the state is, right? Well, if the last action succeeded equals false, then we've encountered an error, right? So whenever we hit an error right here, then the last action succeeded is going to equal false, and it's going to persist all the way through. So whenever we hit here, in fact, this condition is going to be met, so we will process this. But if we don't have a problem, we've never set this to false, last action succeeded will remain true, and so we should bypass this altogether. We won't ever enter it, right? So that's an example of using a task sequence variable that we're not defining anywhere. It's a system variable as a conditional to get into this section, right? Well, then there's other steps in here. This is really basic. Like I said, you could add some more detail to this, to send emails, to maybe do a couple of other things, but the goal of this is maybe you start a lab of imaging 50 machines, you get back from lunch and 5 of them had a problem. Rather than try to dig through all of that in PE in a DOS prompt, maybe you go to your server that contains the logs that we're copying up and review them. This enables that. So the first thing we're going to do is connect to a network folder. So I'm going to map to the C drive and use the P letter P for that. Then I'm going to create my log directory. So just simply make directory p:/logs. Well, now within the logs folder, I want to create a folder specific to my machine name. So at different stages of the task sequence, we will track the machine name, right? Sometimes if it's bare metal, it's the PE machine name, which is a bit cryptic looking, but either way, right, you can track it. In this case, it was a reimage, so I already knew the Windows, or the name of the computer was Windows 8, and so you'll see the folder is Windows 8. Nevertheless, it comes from a variable, right? So just like I would call an environment variable, I just put the percents on either side of it, and it works, right? So I'll create a directory specific to this imaging machine, and then I'm going to go copy the log files up to this folder. So there's another variable here. Notice smsts log path. So I mentioned that the logs will move around as imaging continues. In PE, they will be on the X drive. In the running OS, they will be on the CCM SMSTS log folder. After the OS completes imaging, then they'll just be in with the regular client logs, right? So, but we keep track of that in a variable form, so you don't have to worry about it. All you have to do is refer to the location by this variable and then copy it to the location, again specified by variable, that matches the machine name. And you now have the logs you can look at, and in fact we did that a minute ago, and you'll see that I have the logs. Computer name is Windows 8, and here they are. So I could come back and review them if in fact I would have had an error, which I did, and if it was something that I wanted to look at, I could say partition 20, right? And in fact, there it is, right? Disk partition 20, it doesn't exist or is not a valid volume. So as easy as that, I caught the logs when the problem was there. Now I can go look at it. Now I have CM trace available, and it's a better experience. So just one idea. Again, you can build this stuff out the way you want to. It's really cool once you get into OSD and see how all this fits together, the flexibility that you have, right? So that really wraps up what I wanted to talk about today. Just to introduce some of these topics to get you thinking about them. We'll have more discussion about variables, see how they work a bit more as we go forward. We'll go ahead and wrap session 5 for now, and we'll see you in session 6.